Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Healing Lyme Disease Summit. I am your host, Dr. Mariah Hinchy, and tonight we're going to talk about how tick-borne diseases themselves affect the gut and gut health, as well as how certain pharmaceutical treatments can further disrupt the microbiome, leading to a whole host of issues. I'm super excited about our guest expert that's joining us tonight. He's going to help us navigate through all of this. My guest is Dr. James Neuenschwander. He is a medical doctor and president of the Medical Academy for Pediatric Special Needs. Welcome, Dr. New. Please tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you so much, Mariah. I'm thankful that you invited me here. I am a integrative physician. I actually was brought into this world from treating Lyme with my patients. So I've been in practice in Ann Arbor, Michigan since 1988. I originally was board certified as an emergency room physician. I started doing this work because I was looking at how do you actually heal patients rather than just throw drugs at them. Basically, my practice is chronically ill children and adults, including those, obviously, if you have people that have chronic illness, you're going to run into people with chronic Lyme disease. So it actually started with Lyme, and that brought me into this whole world of pediatrics. So I'm originally a graduate of the University of Michigan. I think they want nothing to do with me at this point, so I might have to stop saying that, but I'll say go blue. And and really most of what I know has been through the many years that I've been in practice, learned from my patients. So most of what I'm doing now is integrated medicine. I still have a board certification in emergency medicine. I think it might be expiring soon, and I'll have to stop saying that afterwards. But I'm board certified in integrated medicine. So, and I am, like you said, the president of the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs, or MAPS. I mean, that's sort of one of the things I'm most excited about is moving things forward in this whole idea of integrative treatment of children, because we definitely have a crisis there.
We do, and they're definitely, from what I can see, one of the underserved, understudied populations when it comes to chronic tick-borne illnesses. And I think that we are still missing the boat in just how much these chronic infections are not picked up on and how much it actually affects the health and behavior of a lot of these kids. So let's start out by talking about how chronic Lyme disease and other tick-borne infections themselves impact our gut and gut health.
Well, the biggest thing that's going to happen, the the tick-borne illness itself can affect the gut, but primarily what it's going to do is alter the immune system function, create inflammation, and then that inflammation is going to alter gut permeability. It's going to, and that's just the lining of the gut has to be very tight. It can't let things in that shouldn't get in. When that gets leaky, when it lets things into the bloodstream that shouldn't get in, it creates all kinds of problems. And again, inflammation created by these chronic tick-borne illnesses can cause problems with that digestive tract, and it will alter the biome, what we call it's the bacterial ecosystem in the gut. So we call that the microbiome of the gut, and it will actually alter that microbiome. Some of it may be, the microbiome trying to help the person deal with the infection, but some of it is a direct impact of that inflammation.
Yeah. And so what symptoms, like what would this look like? What symptoms does this cause?
Well, the trouble is it can be anything across the board. I mean, it could be something obvious, like, somebody is having the abdominal pain, or they're having bloating, they're having diarrhea or whatever. But primarily what we see, and especially, I deal with a lot of kids on the autism spectrum. I deal with kids that have these syndromes, the PANDA syndromes, where they get brain inflammation, you get a lot of behavioral changes. Sometimes you'll just get a behavioral change. You'll get anxiety, or you'll get OCD, or you'll get aggression. So it's not necessarily just the abdominal symptoms. And then the other thing is you can just have a change without getting too graphic or gross here. You can just get a change in the characteristic of the stool itself. All of a sudden it'll have a different smell. There'll be more gas. It'll be a different texture than what it was. So all those things would clue you in that maybe there's something going on there.
Right. And so then what happens when you throw antibiotics in the mix? Especially, a lot of times, like, we need heavy duty combination antibiotics for long periods of time, very, very much longer than a standard course
Right.
of antibiotics.
Well, and it's not just antibiotics, it's also antiseptic herbs. I mean, they're not as destructive to the biome, but we do testing now, and you can tell when somebody's been on one of these antiseptic herbal combinations, or if somebody's been on especially the big gun oral antibiotics that we use. And yes, I mean, we're typically treating for 2-3 months at least for some of these patients that have chronic symptoms. The issue is these obviously are not smart bombs. They're not just going to go after, the Borrelia spirochete or after the Bartonella or whatever what the co-infection might be. They're going to go after anything that might be sensitive to that particular antibiotic or antiseptic herb. And unfortunately, there's a lot of collateral damage when you do that, and you can significantly disrupt the gut ecosystem. So we will routinely see, one of the things we measure when we look at the gut is what is the diversity? How many different bacteria are there in that stool sample? So ideally, it'd be around 500, something like that. Minimum would be maybe 350. But you can see that diversity go from 400 or 500 down to maybe 200 after a round of antibiotics. And the important thing to remember about kids in particular, and this adults our gut ecosystem is much more stable. It's been in a certain way for much, much longer. So if we come in with antibiotics and throw it off its center, throw it out of balance, we're much more likely to bounce back with some simple interventions or maybe just on its own. With a kid, because that ecosystem is not locked in, and it really depends on how old the kid is too, because that system is not as locked in as it is as an adult, when you come in with antibiotics, you could potentially permanently alter that microbiome with those antibiotics. And this is something, the younger the kid, the more likely that is to happen. So if you can have a kid that's like less than a year old, even one round of antibiotics, a 10-day round could cause that to happen. You got a kid that's 3, 4, 5 years old and you're treating Lyme and it's more chronic and you're doing 30, 60 days of antibiotics, you're very likely to alter that ecosystem forever if you don't do something to try and bring it back to some state of balance.
Right. Okay. So, are there any particular treatments that you would recommend doing, like, in conjunction with antibiotics or antimicrobial herbs to prevent things like C. diff, right? That's probably the most commonly known infection that we're trying to prevent, or, fungal overgrowth, candida, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I sort of when I prescribe antibiotics, or if I'm doing the antibiotic herbs, I always will include something that's anti-yeast. I mean, it's almost a guarantee that if you're going to do 30 days of, especially something like doxycycline, with kids, we tend to use the cephalosporin type antibiotics, but they're pretty broad spectrum. So when you're using those kinds of antibiotics, it's almost guaranteed you're going to get a fungal overgrowth. So I typically will add some antifungal to my program. So whether it's using a prescription like nystatin, that's a non-absorbable antifungal for the gut, using a medication like fluconazole, or using some of the myriad of antifungal supplements that we have, the lauricidin or the Paudiarco, or any of the herbal combinations that are out there that are going after this as well. So routinely, I'm going to do that just prophylactically. I'm not going to wait until they have a fungal problem. I'm going to add that in. The other big thing, and we do a lot of what are called prebiotics. So prebiotics are these mainly soluble fibers. They're complex carbohydrates, things that we don't necessarily digest ourselves. We don't have the enzymes to break them down, but these serve as food for the probiotic bacteria in our gut. So making sure that somebody has a decent amount of either in a food source, which is always hard with kids because they're not going to sit down and say, "Gee, mommy, can I have a bowl of broccoli and some Brussels sprouts?" They're not going to want to eat those foods. But if you can get a food, great. Otherwise, it's supplementing with these things, and these would be things like inulin or the FOS, GOS, even some of the grain-based ones like psyllium. There's a number of different prebiotics that we use. So I tend to add those in early on. And then what I'm going to do optimally, I'm going to try and get some sort of gut profile before I'm throwing them on all these antibiotics. So I'll do a baseline evaluation, then we'll treat, and then when we're done treating the Lyme, I'll reevaluate and see where it's at. So at least I know what I'm trying to get back to after I'm done treating them. So if I'm going to mess up that ecosystem, how do I get that back to what it was to start out with? And by doing that, you can usually recover that ecosystem. Even I always say you're going to come in and sort of carpet bomb, and then when you're done, you're going to rebuild the city. That's kind of what you have to do with particularly the sicker kids.
Makes sense. So, as far as prebiotics go, are there certain prebiotics that are good for most different species of normal flora? Like, I know that there are some prebiotics that have been studied and shown to help like certain populations. Are there ones that are more broad spectrum, or do you really feel like, you need to rotate through all of these?
Well, the way we manage probiotics, first of all, just to answer the question, I think the best probiotic out there or
Prebiotic, yeah.
prebiotic out there is partially hydrolyzed guar gum. All right, so this is just PHGG. There's a number of brand names out there, but that's the one that sort of is the broadest spectrum. It tends not to feed things you don't want to feed. It will improve the production of most of the healthy bacteria in a stool sample without necessarily going after other organisms that you don't want. Some of the other prebiotics are a little bit trickier. So without actually knowing what the ecosystem is, it becomes a little more difficult to determine, does a person need that? But that's one of them. The second is I'm a big fan of using acacia. Acacia root is something that feeds Bifidobacillus bacteria, and most of my patients, not just kids, but most of my patients that are chronically ill have low Bifidobacillus species. It's rare that you'll see a high level. So that's another one that's pretty safe to add in, and it doesn't really feed a lot of the other bacteria that we worry about. Other things out there like glucomannan, that's konjac root. That stuff is a great broad spectrum prebiotic, but it can also feed some of the sort of bad lactobacillus that are in the stool sample and actually feed some of the fermentation. So you start somebody on something like that, and all of a sudden they're getting bloating, they're gassy, they're having a lot of flatulence. That just tells you that you're overfeeding some sort of fermenting organism. So by starting with something broad spectrum, we can help balance the ecosystem without necessarily having to do testing. But I've got MD after my name. I'm allowed to do this stuff, so I always will do the testing before I start, so I know what I'm targeting with those prebiotics before I ever start with the antibiotics.
Right. And just a quick question because I know the listeners are going to want to know this. What are your favorite labs to actually evaluate the various probiotic levels?
Well, there's a few different ways to do it. I mean, what we're doing now is something called 16S RNA sequencing. That particular technique will identify all the bacteria in a sample. And if you
Okay.
can identify all the bacteria, then you can determine the percentages of each bacteria. So we're using, there's a couple labs. One's called Biome Site, the other's called Ombre. They'll do this kind of sequencing, and then they give you the bacteria based on the frequency. Now we have a specialized program that we use that takes that data and says, oh, you have 0.03% Bifidobacillus, and that's too low, it should be 3%. So it's the relative amount of each one. So that's become my favorite. There
Wait,
is
so are you saying they actually make the probiotic to go along with the test or they just give you the
um
test?
The companies themselves do, but again, we're using that data a little bit differently than what the companies report out. So we have a separate program that we use. There's also microbiome labs. They do a different technique. It's DNA sequencing rather than 16S RNA. So it's a more expensive test, but the advantage to DNA sequencing, it's not just bacteria, it sequences anything that has DNA in that sample. So that would include yeast and include parasites. So you do
Hmm.
get more information. And again, they will tell you based on what's in that sample, yes, you should use this or that prebiotic. Of course, they're going to tell you to use their prebiotics, but
Right.
still, it gives you an idea of what you should use. So, there are techniques like that out there. There's also, there's a lot of, we use a lot of the, Genova has a stool sample that uses PCR testing. We use GI maps, that's PCR testing. PCR will tell you the amount of an individual organism, but because you're not measuring every bacteria in the sample, you don't know the percentage. So that will still give you an idea. If you do PCR testing and your Bifidobacillus level is really low, okay, you probably have low Bifidobacillus and you need to do something about that. So there are pluses and minuses to all this testing, but it's this is something that's developed over years and years and years of doing this kind of work.
Can you comment on the difference between like the importance of having an astronomical amount of CFUs or colony forming units for the audience, versus having more species and more strains? Because I think people get so hung up on the number. And I just, as long as you are in agreement, I want to kind of get across the point that it's not so much about the numbers, it's about the different species. Because if you can seed as many different species as possible, and then you can give them the food, they're going to do what they do best and multiply. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many places when diversity matters. It matters in so many situations, and this is true of the gut. So, one of the things that we have this term alpha diversity. Alpha diversity means the number of different species in a single stool sample, and then the beta diversity is the difference between stool samples. So, like if I do a stool sample today and I do a stool sample 2 months from now, theoretically, if I'm eating the same thing, the beta diversity should be the same. It should be very low. Whereas the alpha diversity is a number of different species. So we sort of set the minimum at 350. That might be a random number, and to me, that seems like it's pretty low. 500 is kind of what we're targeting. Now, if you look at sort of where we came from, you look at the hunter-gatherer diet, there's very few of these populations left in the world. But if you look at their gut biome, it's not 350 or 500 bacteria. It's more like 1,200 bacteria. But again, when you're a hunter gatherer, it's not like, oh, it's Wednesday, it's Prince Spaghetti Day. No, it's we're going to eat whatever we gather that day. Right, we're going to eat whatever we hunt, whatever we kill, whatever we're able to catch, and that's what we eat that day. So because of that, nature sort of demands diversity. Nature forces the diversity in the diet. And the best way to change the diversity of the gut is to change the diversity of the diet. I deal with kids on the autism spectrum, and there's an autism diet. Right? It's chicken McNuggets, fruit roll-ups, usually some, peanut butter jelly kind of thing. And there's just no variety at all. There's no vegetables. If it's a fruit, it's grapes. There's just not a lot of anything in that diet. And so this is the problem with kids is you're not necessarily, the best source of these kinds of fibers in the diet are root vegetables, and there's more to life than potatoes and carrots. You have to, there's a whole world of root vegetables that most people haven't even heard of. I always say you go to the grocery store, walk past the potatoes, walk past the carrots, and when you walk past something, it's like, what's that? Buy it, and then figure out how to make it. All right, because that's what you need. You need that diversity in your diet to get the diversity in your gut. And then the other thing, I always joke that I do all my hunting at Kroger. That's our local supermarket. Because, and I'm 100% successful. Well, unless the shelves are bare, but it's not like that. We didn't come from that history, right? It's not like you went out hunting and you brought home meat every day. You were successful sometimes and not successful at other times, right? And so it's always a matter of nature required that there was variation in your diet, and then there was also the seasonal variation. You weren't eating the same thing in January that you were eating in June. Whereas now, again, you can get strawberries in January and oranges in Michigan in February. I mean, come on, that's not at all the way it was. And so we don't have the diversity of our diet. And without that, we don't have very good alpha diversity in our stool samples. And without that alpha diversity, you're not going to have very good immune function. And that is the key, especially in kids. That's the key to dealing with most of these tick-borne illnesses, right? I mean, you have areas where Lyme, I'm just going to pick on Lyme and not necessarily co-infections, but where Lyme is endemic, right? Places where Lyme is endemic. If you check blood work on kids, about 15% of them will have antibodies against Borrelia, against the Lyme spirochete. So it means they've been exposed. It means they've had a spirochete infection with Borrelia, but almost all of them are asymptomatic. Why? Because their immune system did what it was supposed to do. And a big part of that is the health of that gut ecosystem.
Right. Yes, that's such an important point and something that I'm very, very passionate about and something that I include in almost every single talk that I do about tick-borne disease. So, can you elaborate a little bit further? You mentioned, increased intestinal permeability, tight junctions earlier. So, going back to that disruption in the gut, when that happens, how does that affect the entire body systemically? And then I'm going to ask you to, just start there, but then we're going to go to the brain and we're going to talk about the gut brain connection and how everything that is going on systemically, coming from this leakiness of the gut going back into systemic circulation, how that impacts the entire body and then the brain.
Sure. So yeah, I'll start with the gut. It's gut, immune, brain. They're all basically one super system. They're all intimately linked with each other. So you start with this idea that one of the functions. I mean, we all understand the gut's function is to get nutrients out of our food and try and eliminate waste. But one really important function of the gut, and if you think about it, is how do we protect our immune system from the foreign proteins that we're eating, because we are taking foreign proteins into our system. So I always say, if you took whatever you had for lunch or whatever you had for breakfast or dinner and you threw it in the blender and you injected it IV, your immune system would freak out, right? It would react. You'd have allergies and all that sort of stuff. So one of the things that the intestine is designed to do is sort of shield the immune system from seeing those foreign proteins that are in our food until they're broken down to a state where they're no longer recognized as foreign. So it starts with the stomach. I mean, this is why it's so important to have good stomach acid, why all these antacids and proton pump inhibitors and H2 blockers, all these medications we have to get rid of stomach acid is such a bad idea. We need that stomach acid to break down those proteins. So most of that protein digestion should happen in the stomach. We have an enzyme called pepsin that goes along with it. If everything was perfect, then we wouldn't need anything else. But as one of my autistic children pointed out to me, Dr. New, everything is not perfect. And so we have to have backup systems. And one of them is when stuff comes out of the stomach, we have enzymes that break down proteins in the intestine. They come from the pancreas. It's just they're working at a neutral pH. So they're nowhere near as effective as the pepsin in the stomach. That's trypsin and chymotrypsin. And so they'll help break down the proteins. We have what's called secretory IgA. These are antibodies made by the lining of the gut. They can find foreign proteins that haven't been broken down, and they'll bind it and make this complex that's too big to get absorbed. So that's another defensive mechanism. But ultimately, what protects us the most is the lining of the gut. So the cells are closely bonded together. We call this a tight junction. There's actually little proteins that hold it together. And if something happens to that junction and causes it to open up, right? So you have a space where there's a protein that hasn't been fully digested that might be small enough to fit through that space, but it's big enough to set off an immune response. So if a protein is less than 100 amino acids long, it's never going to set off an immune response. The immune system is not going to see it as foreign. If it's over maybe 300 or 400 amino acids, the immune system is going to see it. It's that range from 100 to 300 where maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Those are the protein ranges we're talking about that could fit through a open gap. So when these tight junctions open up, we call that leaky gut syndrome, or if you want to be technical, we call it impaired intestinal permeability, but that's allowing those proteins to get in. Now you got a problem, because if this gets in and sets off an immune response, now the body is sensitized. It's like you've created a food sensitivity to that particular protein. And the next time you eat it, the immune system's going to react. And the trouble is, the more inflammation you have, the more of these gap junctions that open up. And so the process just starts snowballing to the point where you'll have people that can't eat anything,
Yeah.
no matter what they eat. If they eat something more than 7 to 10 days, all of a sudden they're allergic to it. They're reacting to it. And that's impaired gut permeability. And it's really important to understand that concept. And again, back to what we started with, that's part of what happens with the infection itself, and definitely part of what happens when you disrupt the ecosystem in the gut.
I know there's an upcoming MAPS seminar that I'm going to be at as well. So I would just like you to share that information with our listeners.
Sure. So my office is actually called Bioenergy Medical Center. I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So my website is just bio energymedicalcenter.com. Phone is 734-995-3200. And we also have a Facebook page. But really, the website is the best way to get information and learn more about the center. The MAPS conference is going to be coming up. I believe it's March 14th through the 16th. We always try to cover St. Patrick's Day, so I get to wear a green suit. But yeah, so it's March 14th through 16th. It will be in Charlotte, North Carolina, and information for that is at the MAPS website, and that's medmaps, medmaps medmaps.org. And you can get lots of information on, for anybody who's a practitioner that's listening, lots of information on, integrative pediatrics, how you can get involved. We're trying to get as many people involved as possible because there's such a huge demand for better care for our kids. This is our future. And if they're growing up sick, what chance do we have? You can see the gray hair. I'm really concerned about who's going to take care of me when I'm old. So it's actually a very selfish thing that I'm doing. I'm trying to help the kids, so I have people to take care of me.
You're so funny. Yes. So also for patients who are listening, MAPS does have a find a practitioner function too. So you can find someone local in your area or someone that you can do telemedicine with to help you if you have a child with special needs or with tick-borne disease. So I think we were talking about impaired intestinal permeability. We were talking about leaking these proteins in, basically igniting like this immune response, right? And so when I'm talking to my patients, I always say, look, we want all of the immune resources that we have available to fight this infection, right? Like we can control pretty much one thing in our lives, one thing in our environment, and that's what we put in our mouth. So if we can start to drain that bucket that's overflowing by omitting certain foods that are triggering the immune system, we can go a long way to not only calm down the immune system, but to give back some of that energy and resource like to the immune system so that it can actually pitch in and fight this infection. Because in my opinion, like in the end, it's the immune system that has to either completely eradicate this infection after it's been shrunk or hold it into remission, right? So recovering from tick-borne disease, to me, the immune system is key. It's the ultimate end point of trying to heal a patient.
Right. And I think that was, I arrived here because I opened a practice in 1988. the tagline for Bioenergy Medical Center was treating illness at its source. So, I was always looking at, because immediately you start seeing chronically ill patients. I mean, I started with adults, and I live in Michigan, so it wasn't long before I started seeing patients that had tick-borne illnesses. Now, at the time, I was kind of clueless. God bless ILADS. Yes, there was an ILADS back then. That this is the International Lyme Associated Disease Society. So, going to ILADS and learning some of these things, and then learning about the antibiotic protocols and starting to use them, and then this set of patients would get better and this set wouldn't. Well, what's going on with this set? Why are they not getting better? Oh, well, maybe there's some problem with their digestion and their gut. And really, integrated medicine starts and ends with the gut. I mean, that's the one thing that we have the most control over, and it influences everything. So that's what got me rolling into the whole tick-borne illnesses. And of course, you start treating parents, and it's like, well, I've got this kid and he's 5, and he has some of the same symptoms I have. Could he have Lyme? And then I start testing these kids, and they're positive. And that's what got me sort of involved with all this. And then it's like, oh, you should check out this autism organization. And that's how I got involved with Dan. And then Dan was Defeat Autism Now, and then from there got involved with MAPS when MAPS started. But yeah, all this stuff goes back to when you have a tick-borne illness, and this is something that the Infectious Disease Society of America just is never going to understand, right? It's not just we need to kill the bug, right? It's almost, I tell my patients, that this idea that bugs cause disease, I think is just not true. Our response to bugs causes disease, right? So that's a big part of what infectious disease is about. And that's why there really is no disease out there that I know of, even things like Ebola, where a person that absolutely everybody that gets the bug has the disease. And it's certainly not true with Borrelia. It's certainly not true with any of the viruses. We saw it with COVID, even, those initial waves where you'd have 60-70% of people that were asymptomatic, that just didn't have any symptoms at all. And then you had people on the other end of the spectrum that died. So it was, there's a huge difference in that immune response. And what I found with all my chronic Lyme patients, and again, this was adults initially, was when you started doing immune testing, what did you find? Low killer cells. I mean, very low killer cells. It's like, well, what does that mean? Probably they burned them killer cells out because they've been trying to fight this infection for 10 years and haven't been able to do it. And then you start looking at food sensitivities, and it's like, oh my God, they got 40 different foods they're reactive to. And then you start looking at antibody levels, and they have either high or low antibodies depending on where they're at in the state of the disease. And then they have adrenal burnout, and they've got all these digestive complaints, and they have skin problems. And it was long before I knew what mast cell activation was. Now all of a sudden it's like everybody is stumbled on mast cell, and the POTS stuff, the postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where you just have vagal dysfunction and the autonomic nervous system doesn't work right, and you walk around with a pulse rate of 120 all the time. So these are all things that manifest because the gut's not working right. And to try and explain that to a cardiologist or explain that to an infectious disease specialist, it's like, whew, they don't get it. They don't get it. And if you can get the immune system on your side, the battle's about 80% won just with that. And the way you get your immune system on your side is you work on the gut. Plain and simple. You can do all the testing you want in the world. I always tell my patients who are chronically ill, look at one of the autoimmune diets, because that's what those diets are about. They're trying to minimize the inflammatory impact of food. You got enough inflammation with your tick-borne illness, right? You don't need to add to it. So what are those foods? Well, sugar's the top of the list, but mainly these are foods that are, the seeds, the grains, the legumes, these things, sorry to all my vegan friends, but a lot of these legumes just are very inflammatory, and particularly to a person that has that sensitivity. If you're Chinese or Korean or Japanese, and maybe you can handle soy. I can't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the most, soy's almost as bad for me as gluten. It's just a very inflammatory food. And getting that calmed down while you're working on getting the gut ecosystem balanced and then working on the tick-borne illness, that combination can move you forward and get you into a state of health.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. 100%. There's two tests that I do on almost every single patient that I have, and that's a white blood cell micronutrient analysis and a food sensitivity panel. And a lot of patients are like, "Wait, what does this have to do with anything?" And I'm like, "It has everything to do with everything, you know?" And unfortunately, we can't just go in a linear fashion. We have to tackle all of this at once. So while we're trying to shrink the infectious load, we have to work on healing the gut, because you can't heal a gut that's infected, right? And we have to get the foods out, and we have to detox and, do all of these things to move the patient in the right direction. But, I think you're 100% right. 80% of it has to do with the gut, with the immune system, with the ability to detox and kind of keep things where they're supposed to be kept, calm everything down.
So,
So I'm going to go back to the brain. So how does all of this impact the brain? And specifically, like, not specifically with children, but do you see this affect the brains of children more than adults? And do you see it affect children in a different way?
well, yes. I mean, again, back to this idea of, if you've got a 4 or 5 year old, the brain circuits are developing. The brain is full of stem cells. The brain hasn't fully developed. You alter that environment positively or negatively, you can change that child's brain for the rest of their life, right? So, as opposed to an adult where it's a much more stable, well, stable in this way. It's a much more stable situation with the brain. It's not as plastic. There's still neuroplasticity, where the brain can change, but it's not as plastic as a 4 or 5 year old kid's brain is. The second thing is this whole concept of the blood-brain barrier, where again, the brain is, we call it immunologically privileged. The brain, it doesn't really have white blood cells. It has these cells called microglia. So these microglia are modified brain cells that take on the function of a white blood cell. So if there's inflammation, they get all excited and swollen up and all that sort of stuff. But the brain doesn't typically have like B cells or killer cells or the stuff that the rest of the body has. So in order to protect the brain, you have to have a barrier between the blood and what's in the brain, right? Because your brain is not bathed in blood. Your brain is bathed in cerebral spinal fluid. So that's sort of the brain's blood supply, is the spinal fluid. And so there has to be a barrier there. So the blood-brain barrier is not as well developed in children as it is in adults. And this is particularly true with very young children, right? If you're talking infants and children less than a year or 2 years old, that blood-brain barrier is not established the way it is in adults. The other thing that, there's sort of a saying, as goes the gut blood barrier, as goes the gut permeability, so goes the blood brain barrier. So the same things that affect gut permeability will affect the blood brain barrier. So if you blow open that blood brain barrier, you have the same problem, except in this case, you're not getting things into the bloodstream, you're getting things directly into the brain. So you start looking at the brain and there's antibodies there. It's like, where the heck do those antibodies get? How did they get in? They're way bigger than the pores in the gut brain, in the gut brain. That'd be a heck of a barrier. In the blood-brain barrier, how did they get in? Well, because you blew open the permeability, and so you'll find antibodies in the brain. And this is where, particularly with younger kids, their behaviors haven't been as established. The language hasn't been as established. We don't have the pathways that have just been drilled down, and they're, when we create pathways to do things, if you want to become a concert pianist, what do? You practice 2-3 hours a day for 20 years. That's what you do. And what you're doing is you're just cementing those pathways into your brain.
All right. When you've got a 4 or 5 year old, 8 or 10 year old, they have some of that cemented in, but it's nowhere near what an adult does. So it's so much easier to disrupt those pathways with whatever gets into the brain. And that's why with kids, we'll see these syndromes like PANS or PANDAS. PANDAS is from strep, but you can get PANS from Lyme. And this is the pediatric acute neuropsychiatric disorders, where you have a kid, maybe they're on the spectrum, maybe they're completely neurotypical, but overnight their behavior changes. All of a sudden they become OCD, they become anxious, they're drooling, they don't want to go to school, they're crying, they're miserable, they're aggressive. What happened? Well, it turns out their brains are inflamed. Where is the inflammation coming from? Well, part of it can be a direct infection from something like Borrelia, neuroborreliosis, but a lot of times it's a secondary thing, where you've got the gut is messed up, the immune system's on fire, and the immune system starts making autoimmune antibodies against the brain. And you can measure these in the blood and you go, whoa, why are you making antibodies against your dopamine receptors? Why are you making antibodies against your neurons, against your serotonin receptors, against the structural proteins of your brain? That's what PANS and PANDAS is all about. And we know that Lyme is one of the things that does that. And tick-borne disease is one of the things that does that. And Bartonella is the worst, right? You get a kid that, I just had one last week. It's kid comes in and it was actually a Zoom appointment, right? It was a kid that I've been seeing for other problems, and he's so much worse, and he's this and that, and he's aggressive, and he never was before. And the teachers at his ABA center are saying that he's trying to bite the therapist, and he's pushing other kids, and it's just not like him. He's like a different kid, and it's like, anything else different? Well, he's got this rash. Some shirt, he's got these red lines on his back. I go, okay, I know what that is. It's Bartonella, right? So you have to be looking for these things. You have to be aware of these things. And I live in Michigan. At least you're on the East Coast. At least where you're at, people understand there's Lyme, right? In Michigan, there's this denial. There's Lyme in Connecticut, there's Lyme in Minnesota, there's Lyme in Indiana, there's Lyme in Illinois, there's Lyme in Ohio, there's Lyme in Pennsylvania. But there's no Lyme in Michigan, because apparently the ticks just come up to the Michigan border and they go, oh no, we can't go there. And if you're not trained, if the practitioners are not trained to recognize this stuff, they're going to look at that and go, well, that's interesting. He has stria. Well, those aren't stria, right? He has stretch marks. Why is an 8-year-old have stretch marks? Not a morbidly obese 8-year-old, a normal 8-year-old. Why all of a sudden do they have stretch marks? And the stretch marks came with the behavior changes. Let's try and be a little bit holistic here. Those two things are connected to each other. And again, when we look at what's going on with the gut, and you don't have to go any further than, how do you feel when you have belly pain? You get abdominal pain, you have cramping. How kind and sweet are you going to be? How irritable are you going to be? Are you going to be able to think things through? Are you going to even want to think about anything? No, because your gut pain is drawing all your attention there and you can't function. That's a real simple example. What I'm talking about is you get this impaired intestinal permeability, you get this leaky gut stuff, you get the wrong biome, and we'll get to what the bacteria do, but you get that immune system flamed up, and any autoimmune antibody you have comes along for the ride. Rising tide raises all boats. Well, some of those boats are autoimmune antibodies, and you raise those up, and all of a sudden you have something that wasn't a problem because the level was too low. Now it's reached a certain threshold where it is causing problems. So that's the gut permeability. The thing with the bacteria in the gut is it's not just that they're, we forget that these bacteria, without them, we would die. We need them to provide specific nutrients, like all the vitamin K we get unless you're taking it. Vitamin K we get are for bacteria in our small intestine, right? They're made. And there's other nutrients that bacteria make for us. There's nutrients that we need the bacteria in order to absorb it. There are toxins that are in our food that the bacteria help break down. People know about oxalates. Oxalates can cause kidney stones and gallstones. Well, there are bacteria in our gut that break down oxalates. In our food. So if we don't have the right balance, all of a sudden your oxalate level's high. And then yeast makes oxalates, and now you're getting kidney stones because you have too much fermentation going on. So bacteria will help us break down toxins in our food. Bacteria can, the wrong ones can make toxins. So some of that's a good thing. There's something called lipopolysaccharide that's made by a certain type of bacteria that sort of helps keep our immune system on alert, so it's ready to go. We're locked and loaded. Obviously too much of it's a problem, but you want to have the right amount just so that immune system isn't, in a coma when you need it. It's ready to go. But there also make toxins that directly impact our brain, right? I mean, the classic is alcohol. Now, there are actually people that have organisms in their gut that make alcohol. There are case reports, but that's just an example. The yeast makes alcohol. Alcohol technically is a toxin that affects our brain. There are many, many toxins like that that are made by gut bacteria, by yeast in the gut, that will affect our behavior. And then the bacteria affect what are called short chain fatty acids. The most important of those is something called butyrate. So butyrate is like brain food. When people do ketogenic diets, they produce these ketones like butyrate, and the brain can use those very, very efficiently. So we know that the balance of the short chain fatty acids affects mood. It affects the way we function. And there's a whole mouse model of autism where if you take a different short chain fatty acid, something called propionate, if you inject propionate into a mouse brain, the mouse becomes autistic. What makes propionate? Clostridia. That's a bacteria. And what do 80% of kids on the spectrum have an overgrowth of in their gut? Clostridia. Right. So are there connections there? So the bacteria will make toxins that affect us. They will make, they will affect the short chain fatty acids, either good or bad. Butyrate, feel better. Propionate, not so much. And then you have to remember that the majority of particularly our serotonin, something like 80 or 90% of all our serotonin is made by gut bacteria. And dopamine, norepinephrine, and some of these other neurotransmitters, they're not mainly made in the brain. They're made outside of the brain, and a lot of it's happening in the gut. So the better that gut balance is, the better the brain's going to work. Less inflammation, better neurotransmitters, better short chain fatty acids, fewer toxins.
Yeah. It's you did a great job of just kind of tying all of that together there. And it all goes back to the gut more and more.
It's all about the poop.
All right. So, what advice do you have for parents or caretakers that have a child that has like this abrupt change in behavior?
Well, I mean, first of all, if it's a kid, find a MAPS doctor, because we're all familiar with this stuff. You want to look up this idea of PANS and PANDAS and see who in your area knows what that's about. Again, if you look up a MAPS practitioner, you're gonna find people that are aware of PANS and PANDAS, and sometimes somebody will evaluate your kid and it's like, ooh, okay, you're out of my league. I need to send you to somebody else that has more expertise in this, but at least they'll recognize it. All right.
Yeah.
So a lot of, if you go to a standard pediatrician, they're going to send you to a pediatric psychiatrist, and they're going to treat your PANS, PANDAS, tick-borne illness with Abilify. They're not going to treat the underlying cause. They're just going to treat the symptom, which is the behavior. So you want to get somebody that knows what they're doing, as an adult. Yeah. Find an ILADS doctor, find a, doctor that has some training in integrative medicine and understands these syndromes. That's very, very important. The second thing is start working on the gut. I mean, you don't have to have a medical degree to do something about this stuff. And a big part of it is work on the diet. Don't feed fermentation. Add in some prebiotics. Like I said, the partially hydrolyzed guar gum is a great place to start, because you're probably not going to cause any harm. And you can significantly improve the bacteria that make butyrate, the bacteria that help balance the ecosystem. We call them keystone organisms, and a bunch of those keystone organisms are fed by that partially hydrolyzed guar gum. And there's some very good products out there. And again, you don't necessarily need a practitioner to move forward with that. And then, again, you have to deal with whatever the underlying issue is. If you have sudden behavior changes like that, always be thinking infection, not just tick-borne, but, infection, that there's some kind of infection that's setting off an immune response, and that immune response is creating the behavior changes that you're seeing.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. It has been an honor to have you here and to talk with you. Any last words of advice or anything you would like to say before we conclude our interview?
Yeah, I just want to. I try to beat this into all the practitioners at my office. There's a biochemical reason for all the behaviors we see, right? So, if you have, particularly with children, if you have a child that all of a sudden is anxious, or you have a child that all of a sudden is, obstinate or oppositional, well, yeah, that could be a behavioral problem, but usually there's some biochemical reason why that's happening. And you really want to find somebody that understands that and is treating that cause. Please don't take your child to the psychiatrist and put them on medication without exhausting your other possibilities, because the medication is only going to create more problems. It's not going to address the underlying issue. That's going to be ongoing. And remember, that child's brain is developing. It's not a done deal. You're not dealing with a 50-year-old. You're dealing with a brain that is actively developing. And the more negative you do to that brain, the more likely that child is to have problems for the rest of their life. So it's really important that you jump on this stuff. You find somebody that understands the underlying causes. And again, I'm predisposed to sending people to MAPS, but find a MAPS doctor, because they will help you understand why your child is doing what they're doing and help you find some of the solutions. But like I said, the biggest thing we can do, diverse diet, clean things up. There's a good reason why they have organic food out there. I know it's expensive, but find out foods that are worth buying organic. The Dirty Dozen, the Dirty 30. Don't eat any of those foods if they're not organic. If you're going to eat animals, don't eat animals that are fed crap. They need to be free range and grass fed. They're not just buzzwords. They actually mean something. And it's the same with fish. If you're going to eat fish, which is kind of iffy, but if you're going to eat fish, then make sure it's wild. Make sure it's caught in water that's not, you don't want to eat your fish if it's caught right off the coast of New Jersey. I mean, you want to have fish that grew up in reasonably clean water. Right. Or, Gulf of Mexico is another big one. I mean, it's pretty polluted there, and you want to make sure that you're eating clean food. Feed your kid quality food, good nutrition, organic, all that stuff. If they're having problems, find somebody that understands these links, these underlying causes, and make sure whatever treatments you're doing are treating at that level, not just up here treating a symptom. You have anxiety, oh, here's some Klonopin. No, you have anxiety, and oh, by the way, you have gut problems, and ooh, what's that rash? Oh, you have a tick-borne illness. Let's treat that.
Right. Thank you so much. So medmaps.org, medmaps.org. And also, could you please just state your practice information one more time for our listeners?
Sure. It's Bioenergy Medical Center, and the website's just bioenergymedicalcenter.com. Our office phone is 734-995-3200. Again, we have lots of information on our website on what we do and how to contact us and all that.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Mariah.